Miss Reed, I owe you an apology. Not because you proved us wrong, but because we decided you could not be right. Richard Calloway stood at the head of the private dining table, one hand resting beside an unsigned contract, and the other holding a pair of reading glasses he had removed only moments earlier. The room had gone completely still. 10 minutes before, several executives had laughed when Natalie Reed, the waitress assigned to their table, questioned a zoning map spread across the white linen. Now no one looked amused. A development project worth $800 million had been suspended, a senior vice president had lost control of the meeting, and an elderly woman from the main dining room had been invited to take the chair that should never have been empty. Natalie stood near the coffee service in her black uniform, her expression calm, although every face in the room had finally turned toward her. Richard looked directly at her. He did not speak like a chief executive managing a public relations problem. He spoke like a man discovering the cost of his own silence. You were standing beside the table, he continued, and we treated that as proof that you did not belong in the conversation. Across from him, Preston Hale lowered his eyes. Monica Wells closed the project file in front of her. Near the end of the table, Margaret Ellis held a worn envelope containing a lease agreement, rent receipts, and a relocation notice that should never have been issued. Beside her sat the empty chair that had been reserved for a community representative before Preston decided that such a voice was unnecessary. Rain pressed softly against the tall windows of North and Pine, blurring the city lights beyond the glass. Inside, the polished room no longer felt elegant. It felt exposed. Natalie had not raised her voice. She had not accused anyone of cruelty or demanded recognition. She had simply pointed to one building on the map and said that it was not vacant. Preston had smiled as though she had misunderstood the word. Richard had heard the exchange and said nothing. That silence had allowed everyone else to decide what Natalie was worth before they considered what she knew. Now Richard understood that the apology could not be limited to her. He turned toward Margaret. Mrs. Ellis, you should have been at this table from the beginning. Margaret held his gaze. I was supposed to be, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried farther than Preston's earlier jokes. Your office canceled the invitation. Richard looked at the chair beside her. The place setting had been removed before dinner, leaving only a pale rectangle on the tablecloth where the plate had been. It was a small absence, almost easy to miss. So were 32 households when they appeared only as outdated data in a redevelopment file. Richard slowly pulled the chair away from the table and positioned it beside Margaret. The gesture did not repair anything. It did not restore trust, correct the records, or protect the residents of Harbor Row. But it made one truth visible. Someone had designed the meeting so the people most affected would not be present. The signing is canceled, Richard said. The project is suspended until every resident record is verified and every affected household is heard. Preston leaned forward. Richard, the investors are waiting tonight. Richard did not look at him. Then they can wait. Natalie watched his hand move away from the contract. The expensive pen beside it remained untouched. For the first time that evening, authority was not being used to end a conversation. It was being used to make room for one. 2 hours earlier, when Natalie first entered that private dining room carrying a silver coffee pot, no one at the table had known her name. By the end of the night, the most powerful man in the room would stand to apologize because she had noticed what everyone else had been paid not to see. 2 hours earlier, Natalie Reed entered North and Pine through the staff entrance while rain whispered against the alley windows. The restaurant occupied the ground floor of a restored warehouse near the river, where exposed brick, dark oak, and soft brass lighting gave every room the confidence of old money pretending not to notice itself. Natalie tied her black apron at the waist, checked the evening assignments, and saw the name Calloway Urban Development written beside the private dining room. She knew the company. Everyone in Harbor Row did. Its blue signs had appeared on fences, vacant lots, and notice boards for months, promising renewal in language polished enough to make displacement sound like progress. Natalie had spent 3 semesters studying urban planning before her father died and the tuition bills became impossible. Since then, she worked at North and Pine by night and volunteered twice a week at the Harbor Row Community Center, helping residents organize repair requests, lease records, and city notices they did not always understand. Table for 8, Luis Mendoza told her as he handed over the service notes. Executives, legal counsel, investors. Keep the coffee full and the conversation private. Natalie nodded and entered the room before the guests arrived. A zoning map covered one end of the table beneath a sheet of clear protective film. Beside it sat a leather folder, an expensive black pen, and 7 place settings. The 8th chair stood at the far end without a plate, napkin, or name card. Natalie checked the reservation sheet again. Community representative. Cancelled. No explanation. She looked at the bare chair for a moment, then continued arranging water glasses. At 7:20, Richard Calloway arrived with Monica Wells and 4 senior executives. Richard was 51, broad-shouldered, silver beginning at his temples, his charcoal suit cut with the restraint of someone who did not need clothing to announce authority. Preston Hale entered last, speaking into his phone about investor deadlines before he had fully crossed the doorway. "We sign tonight," he said after ending the call. "No more delays from neighborhood groups." Natalie poured water near the center of the table. Richard opened the folder. Monica reviewed the final compliance checklist. Preston placed a finger on the map and traced a line through the northern block of Harbor Row. "Once demolition begins here, the remaining parcels fall into schedule." Natalie's eyes followed his hand. Building C, for 18, Mason Street, was shaded gray and marked vacant structure. She had been inside it 3 days earlier. Margaret Ellis lived on the 3rd floor. A retired school custodian named Harold Green lived across the hall. More than 30 people still received mail there, paid rent there, and waited for repairs the owner had postponed for years. Natalie set down Richard's coffee. "Excuse me," she said softly. No one answered at first. Preston continued discussing financing. Natalie tried again. "The building marked vacant on Mason Street is still occupied." Preston looked up as if the coffee pot had spoken. "What did you say?" "There are residents living there." His smile arrived slowly. "And you know this from serving dinner?" Natalie kept one hand around the silver handle. "I volunteer at the community center nearby." Monica glanced toward the map. Richard looked at Natalie for the first time, but his expression held curiosity without invitation. Preston leaned back. "We have a certified occupancy report. It may be out of date. It was prepared by professionals." Natalie looked at the bare chair at the end of the table. Was the community representative given a chance to review it? The question caused a pause, brief but noticeable. Preston answered before anyone else. That meeting was no longer necessary. Richard lowered his eyes to the contract. He did not laugh. He also did not ask another question. To Natalie, his silence carried the same message as Preston's smile. The conversation moved on, and the executives began discussing relocation costs for people they believed were no longer there. Natalie returned to the service station, but she could not stop seeing the gray block on the map. A whole building had been reduced to a vacant shape because the only person invited to challenge it had been removed from the room. The dinner continued, but Natalie could no longer hear the conversation as background noise. Every sentence about demolition, acquisition, and schedule seemed to press against the image of 418 Mason Street in her mind. She had climbed its narrow stairs only 3 days earlier, carrying donated groceries to Margaret Ellis. The building was old, yes. The hallway lights flickered. The radiator pipes knocked at night. But it was not empty. It held family photographs, grocery lists, medication bottles, winter coats, and 32 lives that did not disappear because a report used the wrong word. Natalie returned to the private room with the first course. Preston Hale was explaining that Harbor Row had reached full relocation readiness. Monica Wells asked whether all tenant notices had been verified. Preston answered without hesitation. Completed last month. Natalie placed a plate beside him. On the map, a red line now crossed directly through Mason Street. Richard Calloway rested one hand near the contract, listening while Preston described the demolition sequence. "Once Building C comes down, the investors release the second phase," Preston said. "The site becomes financially clean." The phrase caught Natalie more sharply than the word vacant. Financially clean, as if people were clutter. She set the final plate down and spoke before fear could turn into silence. "The notice for Building C was not completed last month." Preston looked up slowly. "We have already discussed this." "No, sir. You dismissed it." One of the executives shifted in his chair. Another looked toward Richard, waiting to see whether the interruption would be allowed. Richard removed his reading glasses and studied Natalie. You said you volunteer nearby? At the Harbor Row Community Center. And you have seen the building recently? This week. Preston gave a quiet laugh. Do you review zoning documents between coffee refills too? Two people at the table smiled. Natalie did not. She glanced at the map, then at the empty chair. Only when they label occupied homes as vacant. The smiles disappeared from some faces, but not Preston's. Miss Reed, this project has been reviewed by planners, attorneys, inspectors, and city officials. Your concern is noted. His tone made the word noted sound like erased. Natalie looked toward Richard. The data is at least 6 months old. Richard's expression tightened. How can you know that from a map? Because the resident count shown here is from before the winter intake. The community center updated the list after the heating complaints began. Monica leaned closer to the map. What resident count? Natalie pointed carefully, keeping her finger above the protective film. There, 21 units occupied. The current number is 32 households. Preston shook his head. Those figures are not part of the certified file. That is the problem. The room grew quiet. Richard's hand remained beside the pen, but he did not pick it up. Do you have evidence? He asked. The question was calm, yet Natalie could hear the challenge beneath it. He expected uncertainty. He expected her to retreat. She looked again at the chair without a place setting. The person who would have brought the evidence was removed from your guest list. Monica turned toward Preston. Who canceled the community representative? I did, he said. The consultation phase was complete. Natalie's voice stayed level. Then why was there still a chair reserved? Preston's smile finally faded. Richard looked toward the bare place at the end of the table. The absence that had seemed administrative now felt intentional. Who was invited? He asked. Monica checked the original schedule on her tablet. Margaret Ellis. Natalie felt her breath catch. At that same moment, through the open doorway, she saw Margaret in the main dining room, seated with her granddaughter beneath the soft amber lights. A worn envelope rested beside her plate. Natalie recognized it immediately. Margaret carried her lease records everywhere now because she no longer trusted any office to remember she existed. Richard followed Natalie's gaze. Is that her? He asked. Natalie nodded. Preston closed the folder in front of him. This is becoming inappropriate. Natalie looked back at the map. No, sir. What is inappropriate is discussing where someone will live while making sure she is not in the room. Richard Calloway looked through the open doorway toward Margaret Ellis, then back at the empty chair. For several seconds, no one spoke. Preston Hale was the first to recover. She is having dinner with family, he said. We should not involve a resident in a private corporate meeting without notice. Natalie held his gaze. She had notice. Your office canceled it. Monica Wells turned her tablet toward Richard. The original invitation was sent 9 days ago. The cancellation came from Preston's department yesterday afternoon. Richard's expression did not change, but his hand moved away from the contract. Why? He asked. Preston straightened his cuff. Because the consultation phase was complete, and the investors wanted a clean agenda. Natalie glanced at the map. Clean for whom? Preston ignored her. Richard, we cannot turn an $800 million closing into an open community forum because a waitress recognizes someone in the dining room. The sentence landed harder than he intended. Richard looked at Natalie, then at the silver coffee pot in her hand, as though only now noticing how long she had been standing there. Miss Reed, he said, would Mrs. Ellis be willing to speak with us? Natalie did not answer for Margaret. You would have to ask her. Richard nodded once. Please do. Natalie set the coffee pot on the service table and walked into the main dining room. Margaret looked up before she reached the table. At 72, she carried herself with the careful dignity of someone accustomed to offices losing paperwork and officials forgetting promises. Her granddaughter, Claire, glanced toward the private room with concern. Is this about Mason Street? Margaret asked. Natalie nodded. They are reviewing the project tonight. They listed the building as vacant. Margaret's face became very still. They know it is not. Would you be willing to tell them? Margaret looked at the worn envelope beside her plate. I already tried. This time, the chief executive is asking. Margaret picked up the envelope. Then he can listen. Natalie led her into the private room, while Claire remained nearby. No one laughed when Margaret entered. Richard stood, but Preston stayed seated. The empty chair waited at the end of the table without a place setting. Natalie pulled it back for Margaret. Before she could sit, Preston spoke. Mrs. Ellis, I want to be clear that this dinner is not a formal hearing. Margaret looked at him. That has never stopped you from making formal decisions here. Monica lowered her eyes to the tablet. Richard gestured toward the chair. Please sit. Margaret did, placed the envelope on the table, and removed a lease agreement, 3 rent receipts, a maintenance request, and a relocation notice. I live at 418 Mason Street, apartment 3B, she said. I paid rent 6 days ago. She slid the receipt toward Richard. The heat in the East Wing failed twice this winter. Here are the repair requests. Monica began comparing the dates with the compliance file. Margaret added the relocation notice. This arrived without a signature from the property office and without the city contact information required at the bottom. Preston leaned forward. That may be an administrative error. Margaret opened her phone. There are 32 households in our building group. 27 paid rent this month. For our unapproved assistance plans, 1 unit is temporarily empty because the tenant is in rehabilitation. Natalie watched the faces around the table change, not dramatically, but one detail at a time. Monica stopped scrolling. One executive folded his hands. Richard read the rent receipt twice. Why does our file show 21 occupied units 6 months ago and 0 now? He asked. Preston answered carefully. The report was based on the relocation schedule. Margaret looked at him. A schedule is not a fact. Richard turned to Monica. Check the source document. She opened the archived file and compared it with the version prepared for signing. Her brow tightened. The resident list was replaced 3 days ago. Preston's jaw shifted. Updated. No, Monica said. Replaced with an older version. The rain continued against the windows. Natalie looked at the contract, the map, and the chair Margaret now occupied. The room had finally gained the voice it was designed to exclude. Richard slowly removed his reading glasses. Who authorized the replacement? He asked. Preston did not answer. Preston Hale kept his eyes on the table. My team handled the final document set, he said. Monica Wells did not look up from the archived files. That is not what Richard asked. Her fingers moved across the tablet, opening the change history. A list of revisions appeared, each marked with a date, time, and user identification. Natalie stood beside Margaret, silent now. The room no longer needed her to argue. The evidence had begun speaking for itself. The resident list was replaced at 11:43 on Monday night, Monica said. The zoning occupancy note was changed 12 minutes later. The edit came from an account assigned to Preston's development group. Preston leaned back. Then someone used the wrong file. Monica opened the next record. The revised version was reviewed and approved from your credentials. Richard Calloway looked at him across the table. The rain had softened outside, but inside the room every sound had become distinct. The hum of the ventilation. The faint clink of a spoon against china in the main dining room. The careful breath Preston took before answering. The older file matched the investor schedule, he said. The current list would have triggered another review. Margaret folded her hands over the worn envelope. Because we are still there. Preston turned toward her. Because the relocation process was supposed to be complete. It was not. It should have been. Natalie felt the sentence settle over the table. Not an error. Not confusion. A decision. Richard's expression hardened. You replaced current resident data with an older report to make the property appear cleared. Preston's voice grew firmer. I protected the closing. If we missed tonight, the financing window could collapse. The city had already delayed us twice. So you removed the people from the paperwork, Natalie said. Preston looked at her. You do not understand the scale of this project. I understand 32 households are not a rounding error. One of the investors shifted uncomfortably. Richard did not take his eyes off Preston. Did you cancel Margaret's invitation for the same reason? Preston hesitated. I removed a distraction from a final business meeting. Margaret looked at the empty place where her plate should have been. I live in the building you were discussing. How am I the distraction? No one answered. Monica turned the tablet toward Richard. There is more. She opened an email thread. Preston's team had discussed the risk that updated occupancy numbers would delay the certification. One message recommended using the previous file until after the signing. Another described community objections as manageable once investor funds were committed. Richard read each line without moving. His hand rested near the black pen, but the pen remained untouched. You knew the report was inaccurate, he said. Preston met his gaze. I knew it was temporary. Temporary until when? Until the deal closed. And after that, Preston looked toward the map. We would have worked through relocation. Margaret gave a quiet, disbelieving breath. After you had the money and we had no leverage. Richard's jaw tightened. For years, he had demanded certainty from his executives. He rewarded people who removed obstacles, shortened timelines, and delivered clean answers. He had believed pressure revealed competence. Now he saw how easily it could reward concealment. I told you this project could not slip again, he said. Preston nodded. Exactly. I did not tell you to falsify occupancy records. You told us failure was not an option. The words were not loud, but they found their mark. Richard looked down at the contract. His own language had traveled through the company and returned as permission. Natalie watched the realization pass across his face, not as shock, but as something heavier. Responsibility. Monica, he said, preserve every file and message connected to Harbor Row. Already started. Notify outside counsel and the city compliance office. Preston stood. Richard, think carefully. If this leaves the room, the investors will walk. Richard finally picked up the pen. For 1 second, everyone watched his hand. Then he placed it across the contract, sealing nothing. If the project depends on a false record, he said, then it was never ready to sign. Preston Hale remained standing, but the authority in his posture had begun to fade. You are making a permanent decision in response to an emotional moment, he said. Richard Calloway looked at the untouched contract. No, I am delaying a permanent decision because the information beneath it is false. Monica Wells closed the tablet cover halfway, leaving the changelog visible. The city compliance office will require a formal disclosure, she said. The investors will be notified that the occupancy certification is under review. One of the investors at the far end of the table spoke for the first time. If the closing is delayed, the financing rate changes. Richard turned toward him. Then it changes. Preston gave a short, frustrated breath. You know what this will cost. Margaret Ellis looked at him from the chair he had tried to remove from the meeting. Do you know what losing a home costs? The question needed no calculation. Natalie stood beside her with the silver coffee pot, now resting on the service table. She had expected resistance, perhaps even anger, but what she saw in Richard was more complicated. He was not simply choosing between money and residence. He was facing the fact that the system had behaved exactly as he had trained it to behave. Deliver the result. Remove the obstacle. Do not bring him uncertainty unless it came with a solution. Preston had not invented that culture alone. Richard had rewarded it for years. We will move this discussion to my office, Richard said. Natalie looked at him. Why? The question was quiet, but everyone heard it. Because this involves legal and financial matters. It also involves Mrs. Ellis and 31 other households. Preston turned sharply toward her. You have already gone far beyond your role. Natalie did not answer him. She kept her attention on Richard. If you take this into a private office, the residents will still wake up tomorrow without knowing whether their homes are being discussed, delayed, or erased. Richard's expression tightened. There are procedures. There were procedures before tonight. Margaret placed one hand on her lease agreement. They did not include us. Monica looked toward Richard. She is right about one thing. Any further action should include documented resident notice. Preston sat down again, as though lowering his voice might restore control. We can issue a statement after council reviews the exposure. Natalie looked at the map. A statement is not the same as a conversation. Richard studied her for a long moment. What are you asking me to do? Pause the signing in writing. Notify the residents tonight. Confirm that no demolition permits will be used while the records are reviewed. Then hold the next meeting with the people who live there in the room. That could take weeks. The project took years to plan. Natalie glanced at Margaret. They deserve more than a few hours to protect their homes. Preston looked at Richard. If you agree to this, every neighborhood group in the city will learn that pressure works. Richard's eyes moved to him. This is not pressure. This is evidence. He stood and walked toward the window. Rain traced slow lines down the glass, dividing the city into blurred towers and reflected light. Harbor Row lay less than 2 miles away, close enough to appear on a development map and far enough to become abstract. Richard had spent decades turning blocks into proposals, proposals into financing, and financing into buildings. He had believed distance helped him see the whole city. Now he wondered what it had prevented him from seeing. Monica, he said, still facing the window. Prepare a written suspension of the closing. Effective tonight. Preston pushed back his chair. Richard, all demolition activity is paused. No tenant notice will proceed. Every current resident record will be independently verified. He turned toward Margaret. You and the other residents will receive the same documents our board receives. Margaret did not thank him. Not yet. And the meeting? She asked. Richard looked at the empty place setting. The next meeting happens in Harbor Row. Natalie felt the room shift, but she did not mistake the decision for repair. One order could pause a project. It could not restore trust. Richard seemed to understand that too. He returned to the table and looked at Natalie. You were right to stop us. She shook her head. I was right to ask you to look. The distinction held him still. For the first time that evening, he understood that the truth had not required brilliance. It had required someone powerful enough to listen before the evidence became impossible to ignore. The written suspension reached every executive at the table before the dessert plates were cleared. Monica Wells drafted the notice on her tablet, read each sentence aloud, and sent it to the board, the investors, the city compliance office, and the legal team overseeing Harbor Row. Richard Calloway approved the message without changing a word. No demolition activity would proceed. No relocation notice would be enforced. No document would be certified until every resident record had been independently reviewed. Preston Hale watched the confirmations appear on the screen one by one. Once this is public, there is no easy way back, he said. Richard looked at him. There should not be an easy way back to false information. Preston pushed the project folder away. You are risking years of work because a server interrupted dinner. Natalie Reed remained beside Margaret Ellis, but she did not react to the insult. She had learned that some people used a person's job title when they had run out of answers. Richard heard it differently now. Earlier, he had allowed the same contempt to pass as humor. This time he did not. She did not create the problem, he said. She was the first person in this room willing to name it. Preston's mouth tightened. You are letting the moment control you. No, Richard replied. I am finally refusing to let the deadline control me. Monica turned the tablet toward him. The suspension is complete. A quiet chime confirmed the final delivery. Margaret looked at the screen, then at Richard. Will the residents receive this tonight? Yes. Not through the property manager. Richard understood the reason immediately. Directly from our legal office and the city liaison. In writing. In writing. And in the languages people in the building can understand. Natalie asked. Monica nodded. We can prepare English, Spanish, and Polish versions by morning. Margaret's expression softened slightly, though not enough to suggest trust had returned. That is a beginning. Preston stood and gathered his papers. Richard stopped him before he reached the door. Leave the Harbor Row files. I am still the project lead. Not tonight. The room became still again. Your access is suspended pending the independent review, Richard continued. You will cooperate with counsel and preserve every communication connected to the occupancy records. Preston looked toward the investors, perhaps expecting support, but no one spoke. He placed the folder on the table and left the room without another word. The door closed softly behind him. Natalie watched Richard as he returned to his chair. The decision had cost him something. She could see it in the way he removed his glasses and pressed his fingers briefly against the bridge of his nose. Yet she also saw that the cost had not destroyed him. It had only stripped away the illusion that leadership meant never admitting uncertainty. Miss Reed, he said, I would like to speak with you privately. Natalie glanced at Margaret. Mrs. Ellis should remain. Richard paused, then nodded. Of course. He asked how Natalie knew the resident count, why she volunteered at the community center, and what experience she had with planning documents. She explained that she had studied urban planning before leaving school after her father's death. She did not dramatize it. She simply described the years that followed, the rent increase that forced her family from their apartment, and the reason she had never stopped caring about how cities treated people without influence. Richard listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, I should have asked who you were before deciding what your words were worth. Natalie looked toward the bare place setting. You should have asked who was missing before you began the meeting. The answer struck deeper than accusation. Richard followed her gaze to the chair at the end of the table. He had approved hundreds of meetings designed for efficiency. He had never considered how often efficiency began by deciding whose presence was inconvenient. You are right, he said. Natalie shook her head. This is not about me being right. Then what is it about? Margaret answered before Natalie could. Whether you will still remember any of this when there is no waitress standing beside your contract. Richard looked at both women. The investors were waiting. The board would call before midnight. The newspapers might have the story by morning. But none of those pressures felt as important as the question Margaret had placed before him. He rose slowly from his chair. Everyone remaining in the room turned toward him. Natalie did not know yet that he was about to apologize. She only saw a man finally standing where his title could no longer protect him from the truth. Richard Calloway stood beside the unsigned contract and looked first at Natalie Reed, then at Margaret Ellis, then at the empty chair that had shaped the entire evening. The room was quiet enough for the rain against the windows to sound like a clock. He removed his reading glasses and placed them on the table. "Miss Reed," he said, "I owe you an apology." Natalie did not move. Richard continued before anyone could interrupt. "Not because you proved us wrong, but because we decided you could not be right. We judged the value of your words by where you were standing." His gaze shifted toward the silver coffee pot near the service table. "You were serving dinner, so we treated your knowledge as an intrusion. That was not professionalism. It was arrogance." One of the executives lowered his eyes. Monica Wells closed the tablet in front of her, leaving the written suspension visible on the screen. Richard turned toward Margaret. "Mrs. Ellis, I owe you an apology as well. You were invited to represent your neighbors, then removed because your presence was inconvenient to the schedule. We discussed your home, your lease, and your future as if they were lines in a financial model." Margaret held the worn envelope against the table. "An apology does not reopen a closed door," she said. "No," Richard replied, "but it can begin by admitting who closed it." He looked around the room. "This company chose speed over verification. My team changed records, excluded residents, and prepared to sign a contract built on information we knew was incomplete. Preston is responsible for his decisions, but I am responsible for the culture that made those decisions seem acceptable." The words carried no polished excuse. Richard did not mention investor pressure or city delays. He did not say mistakes were made. He named what had happened and where responsibility began. "I told people failure was not an option," he said. "I rewarded clean results and quick answers. I did not ask what had been removed to make those answers possible." Natalie watched him closely. This was the first time that evening he had spoken without protecting his position. Richard stepped away from the head of the table and walked toward the chair beside Margaret. He pulled it fully into place, then added a plate, a folded napkin, and a water glass from the unused service setting. The gesture was simple, but it changed the shape of the room. "This seat should never have been empty," he said. "And no meeting about Harbor Row will continue without resident representation." Margaret looked at the chair, then at him. "Not just me." "Agreed. Tenants, small business owners, seniors, and families receiving assistance." "Agreed." Monica opened her tablet again and began recording the conditions. Richard added that the independent review would include resident-selected observers. All current records would be shared in plain language, and no revised project would move forward without a public meeting in Harbor Row. The investors exchanged uncertain looks, but Richard did not seek their approval. "The project is suspended," he said. "Not hidden, not delayed quietly, and not moved into another room. Suspended." Natalie glanced toward the contract. The black pen still lay across it, untouched. Richard returned his attention to her. "I cannot undo the way we treated you tonight." "No," Natalie said. "You cannot. But I can make sure the next person does not need proof in her hand before anyone listens." Natalie looked at Margaret. "Then start with the people who have been speaking for months." Richard nodded. "We will." Margaret placed her lease agreement on the table, no longer as a defense, but as the first document in a new conversation. Outside, the rain began to ease. Inside, no one applauded. The moment did not need celebration. A powerful man had stood up, but the real change was that he had finally made room for others to remain seated. 3 months later, Harbor Row looked less like a project boundary and more like a neighborhood again. The independent review confirmed that several buildings marked for demolition could be repaired, and the revised plan preserved housing for current residents while adding new commercial space, safer entrances, improved heating systems, and a community office where tenants could review every future proposal before it reached a boardroom. Margaret Ellis joined the Resident Advisory Council with 6 other neighbors, including a small business owner, a single mother, and a retired city inspector. Their votes were recorded in every major planning decision. Preston Hale remained under investigation and no longer controlled the project. Richard Callaway attended the first public meeting without a private entrance, a prepared speech, or a seat at the front. He sat in the second row and listened while residents described what they needed from the redesign. Some were angry. Some were cautious. None were interrupted. Natalie Reed stood near the back of the community center, no longer wearing her restaurant uniform. A local civic foundation had offered her an independent scholarship to complete her urban planning degree after hearing how she had helped uncover the false records. She accepted only after confirming that the award carried no obligation to Callaway Urban Development. By day, she returned to class. In the evenings, she continued helping residents organize leases, repair requests, and planning questions. Richard offered her a place on the company's internal advisory team, but Natalie chose the Harbor Row Council instead. "I can work with your company," she told him, "without working for it." He accepted the distinction. 1 year after the dinner at North and Pine, the redesign project received approval. Building C remained standing. Its exterior was restored, its heating system replaced, and its residents were guaranteed long-term leases with transparent rent protections. The new development still moved forward, but not by pretending the old neighborhood was empty. On the evening the final agreement was signed, Richard returned to North and Pine with Monica Wells, Margaret, Natalie, and several residents. The private room looked almost unchanged. The same dark wood, the same amber lights, the same rain-softened city beyond the windows. But the table was different. Every chair had a name card. Every place setting was complete. Before the meeting began, Richard walked around the table and checked each seat himself. "No one missing?" he asked. Margaret looked around. "Not this time." Natalie sat beside her with a folder of revised plans. Richard did not ask for her opinion as a gesture of politeness. He waited until she finished reviewing the documents, then listened as she questioned the placement of the community entrance. The architect took notes. No one laughed. Later, when the contracts were signed, Richard placed the black pen beside Natalie's folder instead of at the head of the table. She left it there. The night did not belong to one person. It belonged to everyone who had finally been allowed into the room. What do you think mattered more, Richard's public apology or the decisions he made afterward? And would you have spoken up if everyone around you had already decided your voice did not belong? Share your thoughts, and if stories about quiet courage, dignity, and unexpected truth stay with you, subscribe to the channel for more. An apology can open a door, but respect is proven by who is invited to walk through it.